Welcome. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. This is the sleep menu. Tonight, a day in the life of a tired archer queen. Before we go further, subscribe and comment down below from where you are watching this. Her eyes opened in the hush before the dawn. The kind of hour that doesn't belong to anyone, where even the wind seems hesitant. The world outside her tent held its breath, waiting for the first thread of light to spill across the dirt paths and worn stone. She didn't move at first, just let herself exist in the stillness. Her breath was the only rhythm in the room, slow and quiet, the kind of silence that wraps itself around your bones. The blanket was rough wool, familiar from countless nights. It clung to her legs, heavy but comforting. One hand rested on her stomach, rising and falling with each breath. Her mind was quiet, not blank, just still. The ache in her shoulders reminded her she was alive, that she had fought yesterday, or maybe just carried too much. She no longer tracked the difference. Pain came from many places. It didn't really matter where. She turned slightly, letting her legs fall off the side of the cot. The soles of her feet touched the cold stone. She closed her eyes for another moment. That cold helped. It pulled her out of the fog of sleep, reminded her there was weight to the world, that she was still here. Her bow stood in the corner, leaning against the wall like it always did. Upright, dependable. The wood was worn smooth where her fingers had gripped it hundreds, maybe thousands of times. There were new bows available, better ones maybe, but she never took them. This one was hers. It had been through every battle, every silent watch, every moment where one arrow had to count. She didn't need to test it. She knew it. Her fingers found the leather bracer on the side table. She slid it over her arm with practiced ease. It was a motion drilled into her by repetition. Tighten, twist, secure. The smell of old leather mixed with the morning air, damp and cool, tinged with something green from the grass outside. A muffled sound filtered through the tent flap. Metal shifting. Someone changing posts or adjusting gear. Nothing urgent, just life continuing around her. She took a breath. Then another. Eyes still on the floor. She knew she could stay seated a little longer, but she also knew she wouldn't. One hand pressed down beside her, the other steadying the bow. She rose to her feet slowly. There was no ceremony in it, no grand purpose, just necessity. She stood because it was time to stand, because the day wouldn't wait. And it never did. The camp was still asleep when she stepped outside. A faint mist hugged the ground, low and curling around boots and tent stakes. It softened the edges of everything. Tents, barrels, weapons leaned against walls, until the world looked like it had been drawn in charcoal and left out in the rain. The sky had started its shift, black retreating into bruised blue, then pale gray. Not yet morning, but getting there. The stars were fading reluctantly, one by one swallowed by the slow creep of day. She moved slowly, not because she was tired, though the weariness lingered in her bones, but because there was no reason to rush. The quiet deserved respect. Her boots made soft sounds against the packed dirt, a steady rhythm that didn't disturb the moment. Each step left a shallow imprint in the mud that would dry and vanish by noon, like she had never passed through. The training field stretched ahead, empty and still. Just a patch of earth worn down by repetition, arrows buried in straw, scuffed ground from footwork drills, and the faint scent of old sweat soaked into the soil. It wasn't a battlefield, but it had its history, her history. She paused at the edge of the field, let her eyes drift across the space without focusing on anything. Not watching, just remembering. Her hand moved without instruction, reaching for the bow slung over her shoulder. She drew it forward, fingers curling around the grip like they had 1,000 times before. An arrow came next, pulled from the quiver with quiet efficiency. The motion felt older than her name, older than the walls of the camp. She didn't aim. Not yet. Just lifted the string to her cheek and let it rest there, feeling the familiar tension ripple through her arms. One breath. Hold. Release. The arrow struck the center of the straw dummy. She barely saw it land. Another, then another, then another still. She wasn't counting. She never did. That wasn't the point. This wasn't for practice. This wasn't for anyone else. Each arrow was a heartbeat, a grounding, a reminder. The mist shifted as the breeze changed. Behind her, faint sounds began to filter through the quiet. The creak of wooden doors opening. The soft clang of iron on iron. A murmur of voices from the kitchen tent, followed by the warm scent of baking bread drifting toward her like a memory. Someone had started the fire early, probably the same cook who always forgot the salt. Her breath came slower now, not from exhaustion, but from ease. She moved again. Another arrow, another shot, each one carving out a little more clarity in her mind. She remembered once, long ago, a mentor told her the field never lied, that how you stood, how you shot, how you breathed, all of it showed who you were that day, and she believed it. She loosed one final arrow, let it sail, watched it vanish into the straw with a soft, dry sound. Then she lowered her bow. Her arms fell to her sides, and for a moment, the world felt quiet again. She turned away from the field. The day hadn't begun. Not officially. There would be briefings, patrols, scouts, coming and going, decisions to make, but all of that would wait. This moment, the mist, the cold, the pull of the bowstring was hers. A quiet check-in, a soft start, a reminder she was still here, and she still knew how to fight. She passed through the heart of the camp like a shadow, not trying to hide, just moving with the rhythm of someone who'd done this more times than she could count. Familiar boots, familiar path. The dirt beneath her soles remembered every step, every turn like an old partner in a dance. The tent stood like silent sentries, canvas edges fluttering gently in the breeze. Some had been patched with care, others left rough, fraying at the seams. Each one had its own story. A few voices had begun to stir, soft greetings, low laughter, the muted scrape of armor plates being adjusted, the clink of metal on metal. But no one called out to her. Not yet. They knew her pace. They knew this time was hers. Her destination wasn't a war tent or command post. It was the mess. A modest structure thrown together with planks, patches, and care. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Smoke escaped lazily from a narrow chimney. Inside, warmth pulsed outward in waves, firelight, heat from boiling pots, and the yeasty comfort of bread just pulled from the hearth. The scent curled around her like a memory. She nodded at the cook as she stepped inside. He returned it without a word. That was their routine. Every morning the same greeting. Wordless, quiet, understood. He slid a wooden bowl toward her. Porridge, as usual. A crust of dark bread rested on the edge. She took both and moved to the bench in the far corner, where the shadows still lingered. She didn't eat quickly. Each bite was slow, measured. Not out of ritual, but because there was no reason to rush. The day would bring its urgency soon enough, and she would answer it when it came. For now, the warmth in the bowl was enough. Around her, the room lived its own rhythm. At the far table, two younger soldiers whispered over a map, fingers tracing roads and terrain marks they barely understood yet. They argued softly about which pass was faster, which forest too thick to march through. Nearby, a veteran sat alone, sharpening a blade in slow, even strokes. His whetstone moved like a metronome, back and forth, back and forth. Everyone had their version of preparation. This was hers. She tore a piece of bread, dipped it into the porridge and let it rest in her mouth before chewing. Her eyes wandered, not watching, just observing. The flicker of firelight on wood beams, the soft pat of wet boots on the stone floor, a draft curling under the door and brushing her ankle, the sound of someone filling a water skin, a low chuckle at a shared joke. She finished the last bite and sat for a moment longer, hands wrapped around the empty bowl. Not for warmth, just for something to hold. The wood was rough against her palms, worn smooth in places by other hands. She liked that. It made the silence easier. Then she stood, quietly returned the bowl, and nodded once more to the cook. Again, no words were needed. He nodded back and slid another bowl down the counter, already moving on to the next. Outside, the day had finally arrived. Pale sunlight spilled over the tops of tents and lit the road ahead. Shadows pulled back to reveal the camp fully awake. Voices grew louder. Orders were being issued, schedules, names, assignments. Someone called out for extra arrows. Another checked the wagon wheels. Life unfolded, one piece at a time. She tightened the strap across her shoulder, adjusted the bow. The familiar weight settled into place, not heavy, but steady. She paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the quiet she was leaving behind, then stepped forward. Another day. Same weight, same pace, same tasks, waiting to be done. But hers all the same. And that was enough. The path out of camp led her toward the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and close together, like guardians who remembered every footstep she had ever taken. She didn't have orders. Not yet. But she didn't need them. This walk was a habit, an unspoken part of her morning, one she'd formed long ago when the world still felt newer, when armor didn't rest so heavy on her shoulders and her hands didn't always ache when they closed into fists. Back then, she thought this habit was about preparation. Now she knew better. It was about survival, the quiet kind. The forest greeted her with its own kind of silence. It wasn't empty, not like the silence of a camp before dawn. This was living quiet. A hush that moved and breathed. Leaves rustled gently overhead, stirred by a breeze that wound its way through trunks and branches like it had all the time in the world. It didn't care who ruled what or how many stars a soldier wore on their chest. It was older than any battle, older than any queen. She followed a trail only she seemed to know. It wove through low shrubs and tall grass, vanishing under roots and reappearing beyond small rises, like a thought half remembered. The ground was soft underfoot, still damp from yesterday's rain, rich with the smell of moss, pine needles, and wet bark. The scent brought something loose in her chest, something unspoken, but felt. A squirrel darted across her path, its claws making faint scrapes on the bark of a fallen log before it vanished into the brush. Birds stirred above, their wings flitting from branch to branch in small, silent bursts. She paused at the base of a tall pine, its trunk wide enough to anchor a tent. She reached out, fingers brushing against the rough bark, not out of sentiment, just to feel something solid, something unmoved by plans, pressure, or politics. Her eyes lifted to the canopy above. Light filtered through and fractured beams, slicing through the green and golden shafts. The ground around her flickered with dancing shadows. She let her breath slow. Let the moment stretch. The forest didn't ask anything of her. It didn't rush. It simply was. She stepped off the trail and found her usual spot, a small rise near a cluster of ferns where the view opened just enough to see the stretch of trees fading into the distance. From her belt, she untied a small cloth bundle, unwrapping a bit of waxed paper with care. Dried meat, a sliver of cheese, leftovers from yesterday's rations. She leaned against the nearest trunk and ate slowly, each bite deliberate, like it was a ritual more than a meal. The bark pressed into her spine. The smell of sap and damp earth grounded her more than any battle cry ever had. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out. Sharp. Clear. The sound echoed once, then was swallowed by the branches. She closed her eyes and listened, letting the sounds of the forest reach her the way voices never could. There were no schedules here, no ranks, no waiting eyes or decisions she couldn't delay. There was only this: breath, light, trees, the rhythm of nature, unchanged by the demands of anyone's war. A gust of wind lifted her hair slightly, tugged at the loose fabric on her sleeve. She stayed still, letting it pass, then blinked slowly as her gaze drifted up again. When the last bit of food was gone, she folded the cloth and tucked it neatly away. Then she stood, stretching her arms until her back gave a quiet crack. The sound was small, but satisfying. She didn't check the sun, didn't wonder how long she'd been gone. Time moved differently here, not slower, just softer. Then she turned and began walking again. No urgency, no destination, just forward through the brush and filtered light. The day would find her soon enough, but for now, this quiet stretch of woods belonged to her, and she walked it like it always had, steady, measured, and wholly her own. By the time she returned to the edge of camp, the morning had taken full shape. The sun sat higher now, casting long, deliberate shadows beneath the tents, and drawing out the subtle heat that clung to canvas and stone. Voices had risen into a quiet chorus, orders passed from one tent to the next, crates being opened and closed, idle chatter drifting like birdsong through the open air. Hammers, tapping, cloth, flapping, the rhythms of a camp wide awake. She moved past the training field again. Now it was filled. Young recruits lined up in uneven rows, bows clutched too tightly, shoulders stiff with effort. Their feet were planted in stances they didn't yet trust, shifting when they thought no one was looking. A drill sergeant barked corrections, not cruelly, but with a kind of tired patience, the sound of someone who'd said the same things to 100 new faces and knew he'd say them 100 more. She didn't stop to watch, just observed in passing, the way someone watches the tide from a distance. A few of them noticed her. Eyes followed her as she walked by, not with fear, but something quieter, something close to reverence. She was older than most of them, quieter, and that quiet carried weight, not the kind earned from shouting or orders, but the kind built over time, slow and steady. She crossed the camp toward the supply tent, weaving between crates and carts and the morning's rising energy. The flap of the tent lifted with a gentle tug, and she stepped into the cooler dimness within. It smelled of leather, oil, and thick canvas, an old, earthy mix that lived in the bones of every soldier who'd spent enough time under its roof. Inside, crates were stacked with precise purpose, some marked in chalk with numbers and dates, others bearing the wear of long travel, scratched corners, faded insignias, dents from careless drops. She didn't need much. Just a few cloth wraps for her fingers, a new string for the bow, and a small vial of wax. Maintenance, not replacement. Habit, not necessity. The quartermaster, a thin man with slow, deliberate hands, looked up briefly as she entered. He recognized her. Everyone did. He handed over what she needed without a word. They didn't need to speak. This wasn't a transaction. It was part of a rhythm, hers and his. Outside again she walked until she found a flat stone near the edge of the main path. Not in the way, not hidden. Just there, solid, familiar. She sat, the sun warming her back as she laid out the items in front of her with quiet precision. First, the bowstring. She held it up to the light, eyes narrowing, frayed in a few spots, worn smooth where her fingers gripped it again and again. She unwound it carefully, coiled it tight, and set it aside. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically, not to delay, but to do it right. The new string slid into place with soft clicks and subtle tension. She pulled and twisted, tested its strength. Then came the wax. She warmed it between her palms until it softened slightly, then pressed it into the fibers in slow, circular motions. Not rushed, just even, focused. This wasn't just upkeep. It was grounding. A ritual her body remembered even when her thoughts wandered elsewhere, even when the noise of the camp buzzed a little too loudly around her. Nearby, a soldier coughed. Another let out a sharp laugh. A horse somewhere behind her snorted and stamped. The sounds of life continued, steady and layered, but none of it pulled her away. She was in between, present, but not part of it. Like a rock in a river, unmoved, while everything flowed around it. When the bow was done, she tested the tension one last time, then set it down and unwrapped the worn cloth from her fingers. She wound fresh strips with practiced grace, tugging them snug, flexing her hands until they felt just right. Tight, but not too tight. Protective, but not a barrier. She sat for a moment longer, hands resting on her knees, eyes half-lidded against the brightness. The dust settled around her boots. A breeze tugged lightly at her hair. In the distance, the training sergeant's voice rose again. Someone shouted for arrows. A dog barked once, then fell quiet. She stood, brushing the dirt from her legs in one smooth motion, and slung the bow over her shoulder. Its weight settled against her back like it belonged there. Because it did. The day had found her. The quiet was behind her now. But it lingered, in the wax still clinging to her fingertips, the scent of pine that hadn't left her cloak, the careful rhythm in her breath. Some afternoons carried a different weight, the kind that didn't press hard, but settled into everything. Quiet, steady, and slow, like ash from a long-dead fire. The sort of weight you didn't notice at first, only realized once you sat down, and it was still there, sitting with you. The sun had climbed high by then, tilting directly overhead, casting shadows that clung tightly to tent poles and weapon racks. The light was harsh, but familiar, the kind that made things look sharper, edges more defined, like the world was trying to stay awake. Heat shimmered off the canvas rooftops in lazy waves. The smell of dust, iron, and something faintly sweet hung in the air. Bees looped from flower to flower along the narrow edge of the camp where someone had planted wild herbs, more for scent than use. The air buzzed faintly with insects, threading their way through the open spaces between boots and barrels, always moving, never loud. By midday, the camp had settled into its routine, a cadence built from repetition. Not loud, just alive. Tools clinked together, metal snapped into place, buckles tightened. Shields leaned in rows against practice posts, each one reflecting a slightly different piece of the sky. There were no shouted orders, only murmurs, soft calls. The shared understanding of people who knew that soon, the day would start asking for more. She walked the rows of tents not because she had been asked to, but because she always did. Her path wasn't fixed, just instinctive, slow, steady. Her steps tracked an invisible thread through the camp, touching corners and angles most forgot existed. A quiet patrol, if it even needed a name. A way to check on things no one had time to put in a report. A cart passed by her, wooden wheels creaking, pulled by two mules more patient than strong. The driver wore a wide hat and nodded once. She returned the gesture with a blink and kept walking. A medic knelt beside a basin tinged pink with whatever had come from a recent injury, wringing out a linen strip with careful, practiced hands. Farther ahead, 3 archers leaned over a table that wasn't meant for strategy, but was doing the job anyway. They argued over fletching glue, one of them waving a half-finished arrow like it made their point clearer. She moved through them like wind in long grass. Felt, but not held. Her presence had weight, but it didn't demand attention. Conversations shifted when she passed, not out of fear, but because she had walked these same rows when others still wore boys' names and new boots. She didn't need to be loud. People remembered the quiet ones better anyway. At the edge of camp, where the tents thinned and the slope took over, she paused. The land dropped away into a stretch of valley that seemed painted more than planted. Deep greens, pale golds, occasional glints of water catching sunlight like glass. Far off, smoke rose from distant chimneys. Thin trails curling upward, the shape of lives moving at a pace different from hers. She crouched low, knees clicking slightly. One hand rested on her thigh, the other keeping her bow steady across her back. She let her eyes scan the horizon without searching, just observing. The wind touched her face and smelled of thyme and dry grass, with a hint of something metallic that always lingered after a skirmish, even if no blood had been drawn. There were no signs of trouble, no scouts, no signal flares, no flags waving for attention, just the open sky and birds flying in loose patterns overhead. It was a stillness that didn't ask questions, only offered a place to be. Time felt different here. Not slower exactly, just quieter, like it moved through a thicker kind of air. Every minute felt like it had more space around it. She stayed longer than she planned, the kind of stillness that rooted in your legs before you noticed. Her mind drifted through familiar fragments, unfinished reports, names that hadn't made the morning muster, the echo of a laugh from a campfire 2 nights ago. She didn't grab at any of them, just let them pass like wind over stone. Eventually she rose. Her back gave a small pop, and she rolled her shoulders until the motion felt clean again. She adjusted the bracer on her arm, sliding the strap through the buckle with the same pull she'd used 100 times before. She didn't sigh, didn't smile, just turned. The camp was waiting, and she would return. Not because she had found anything, but because she never expected to. This wasn't about answers or orders. Sometimes she just needed the distance, the quiet, the shape of land untouched by schedules or expectations, to remind herself of the space between who she was and everything else. The day had shifted again. It wasn't loud or sudden, not like a bell ringing or a storm rolling in, but it was there, woven into the air, a slower pulse, a quieter heartbeat. The camp had taken on a new rhythm. Afternoon tasks faded into a kind of open waiting. Some people rested in shaded corners. Others doubled down on preparation. Everyone, in their own way, was waiting for something, even if they didn't know what it was. She sat on the edge of a supply wagon, boots dangling, a half-empty water skin leaning against her leg. In her hands she rolled a strip of cloth between her fingers, not for any real reason, just something to feel, a small motion to anchor wandering thoughts. The cloth was rough, frayed at the edges, but familiar, like most things in this place. Across the clearing, 2 warriors practiced with staves. Their movements were fluid, almost slow. It didn't look like sparring, it looked like remembering. Their steps were careful, not tired, just precise. A few paces away, a scout lounged beneath a tree, eyes barely open, chewing lazily on a stalk of dried grass. His armor rested nearby, unbuckled and forgotten for the moment. The air held the sounds of camp life at a distance. Quiet, hammering, low conversation, the occasional creak of rope against wood. It all blurred together in the soft hush of a place preparing for dusk. Her shoulders were stiff, but not sore. It was a familiar tightness, the kind that followed a long walk and whispered instead of shouted. Her legs itched in that way that meant they wanted to move again. She didn't mind the ache. It gave the day shape, a body in motion left behind a rhythm, her rhythm. She leaned back slightly, letting her head tip upward. The sky was pale blue now, rinsed clean of the morning's haze. A single thin cloud drifted overhead, barely holding itself together. The sun had passed its peak and was starting to lean westward. casting longer shadows that bled across tents and walkways. The light was softer now, less bright, more gold. With a smooth motion, she hopped down from the wagon and stretched her arms behind her back until her fingers brushed the base of her neck. Something clicked in her shoulder, then eased. She let out a breath, low and steady, and scanned the perimeter of the camp. No one was calling her name, but she didn't believe in idle minutes. While others sharpened blades or rubbed the dust from their armor, she moved between the margins. She checked for the things that went unseen. A rope left too loose, a tent flap torn just enough to matter, gear left in the wrong place. Little things, quiet things. The kind of details that didn't make reports, but sometimes made all the difference. Behind the mess tent, she found stacks of empty crates, bowls crusted with the dried edge of old stew, and footprints half washed by yesterday's rain. A thin cat darted out from behind a barrel, tail high, and slipped into the underbrush. She paused, watched it vanish, then moved on without a word. Near the scouts' quarters, she slowed. One of the tents was missing. The space where it had stood was still outlined in the flattened grass and disturbed earth. The shape was clear. She didn't need to ask who it belonged to. She already knew. They weren't back yet. She crouched beside the footprint of the tent and ran her hand lightly across the ground. Her fingertips brushed dry soil and a single discarded buckle. Not searching, just noticing, just acknowledging, like checking the wind before drawing an arrow. A quiet way of staying connected to things that hadn't happened yet. She stayed in that crouch for a while, arms resting on her knees, the sounds of the camp dull and far away. Thoughts drifted, slow and soft. No answers came. She hadn't expected any. Eventually she stood again, movements smooth and unhurried. She adjusted the wrap on her forearm and dusted her hands against her tunic. The light had shifted again, just enough to signal the edges of evening. A deeper gold, longer shadows. The kind of hour when meals were nearly ready and the fires had just started to crackle in their pits. She turned toward the center of camp, drawn by the distant smell of onions cooking in iron pots and the slow rising curl of smoke. The wind had picked up slightly, tugging at the loose strands of her hair and sending a ripple through the closest tent flaps. Still, no one had called her name. But someone always would. And she would answer. Not because she was asked, but because she was already listening. Evening didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slow, like ink on cloth. First in the corners of the sky, then along the edges of tents, then finally in the shadows that lengthened beneath every boot and barrel. The camp shifted with it. Not quieter, exactly. Just softer. Movements slowed. Voices dropped. The heat of the day loosened its grip, and everything breathed a little easier. She stood at the edge of the water basin, rinsing her hands. The water was cool, clearer than expected, pulled that morning from the stream beyond the ridge. It smelled faintly of stone and pine. She let it run over her fingers for a while, the sensation cutting through the sweat and dust clinging to her skin. Her reflection trembled in the surface just for a second, then disappeared as ripples spread. She wiped her hands on her sleeve, the chill lingering longer than it should have. Around her, the camp was adjusting. Soldiers returned from short patrols, their armor clicking with fatigue. Scouts logged quiet reports with the map keepers, marking notes in charcoal on cracked parchment. Others waited near the mess line, bowls in hand, talking in low voices, or not at all. The fire pits crackled now, alive with orange and red, their smoke rising in loose coils into a darkening sky. The smell of onions, herbs, and something faintly spiced began to coat the air. She moved through it all slowly, not dragging her feet, but walking with a kind of unhurried purpose. There was strength in the ease of her pace, grace that didn't need to prove itself. Her bow rested comfortably on her back, and her fingers traced the edge of the bracer at her wrist, tightening it slightly, checking the strap's grip, then releasing. At the center of camp, a circle of stones marked the main fire. A handful of others gathered there. One tuned a small stringed instrument, the notes uncertain but pleasant. Another stirred a large pot with a long wooden spoon, the steam rising with every slow rotation. A younger recruit tended the fire, poking it now and then to keep it breathing evenly. She lowered herself onto a thick log beside the flames and nodded once to the cook, who handed her a bowl without needing to be asked. Warm stew, earthy, simple, the kind that filled without fuss. She cradled the bowl in both hands, letting the steam rise up to meet her face, warming the space between her skin and thought. The voices around her wove in and out, never demanding. No talk of tactics or orders, just small stories passed back and forth, memories of home, complaints about boots, the odd joke that only half landed but still drew a smile. She didn't speak, just listened. The sounds floated by like falling leaves, brief, drifting, untroubled. The stew was better than usual, or maybe she was just hungrier than she realized. Each bite grounded her a little more. The warmth filled the hollow behind her ribs, quieted the hum beneath her thoughts. She chewed slowly, carefully, letting the pauses between spoonfuls feel long on purpose. When the bowl was empty, she set it gently beside her feet and leaned back slightly, bracing herself with her hands in the dirt behind her. The stars had begun to appear, first in ones and twos, soft outlines, tentative, then in clusters, clearer, brighter, bolder. They began to stretch across the sky like a map only the night knew how to read. The fire popped beside her. A spark jumped. Someone laughed, low and short, but real. She didn't turn to look. Didn't need to. It was enough to feel it ripple through the space like a wave against calm sand. The night continued its descent, slow and steady. The air cooled just enough to raise goosebumps. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. Someone stood to collect bowls. Another began humming an old tune with no words. She stayed seated, not frozen, just still. A quiet stillness earned over years. Her shoulders dropped a little. Her gaze softened. Her hands folded in her lap as the heat from the fire traced gentle arcs across her cheeks. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was something close enough to hold on to. And for now, that was reason enough to stay exactly where she was, watching, letting the dark come without resistance, without fear, just letting it come. Night held its breath, the kind of pause that made every sound feel sharper, not loud but crisp, defined. Every whisper of wind through canvas, every footstep in the gravel seemed more deliberate. Crickets had taken up their rhythm in the tall grass just beyond the tents, their song steady and constant. Insects hummed from time to time, their brief notes cutting the air like sparks. The campfire's crackle now felt louder in the silence, as if it was the only voice left awake. She stood alone near the armory, a small lantern in one hand, its light bouncing against the wooden racks inside. The metal fittings glinted briefly with each sway. The others had long since finished for the night, their duties packed away with the setting sun. But she liked to check the bows herself, not for flaws, for familiarity, for weight, for that quiet moment when your fingers meet something that feels exactly as it should. Worn, balanced, known. The bows hung in neat rows, some new, still sharp with the smell of varnish and sap. Others, older, weathered, their leather grips softened from years of use. She ran her fingers over one, then another, measuring not in numbers, but in feel. One caught her attention, a small crack along the limb, subtle but real, a thin line, like a scar on skin. She set it aside without a word, making a mental note to repair it come morning. Outside, the firelight still flickered, but it was lower now. Just embers, really. The stew was gone. The voices had faded. Most had crawled into tents, seeking warmth and rest. Even the horses had quieted. The night claimed everything slowly, gently, not with force but with steady insistence. She returned the lantern to its hook and stepped outside again. The air was cooler now, enough that her breath clouded faintly before her. The breeze had picked up, carrying with it the smell of smoke, pine, and faint traces of cooked onion. She pulled her cloak a little tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from memory. The kind of pull you didn't argue with. The kind that came from old ghosts walking behind you, silent and heavy. She walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching softly on gravel and dry grass. Her eyes didn't dart. They drifted, unhurried, checking for nothing in particular, but seeing everything. A loose rope here, a flap not secured there. Things others wouldn't notice, but she always did. Far beyond the camp, the trees stood like silent watchmen, their outlines sharp against the starlit sky. The stars above were scattered like ash across a black canvas, some pulsing faintly, others steady and still. She paused for a moment, hands on her hips, watching the stillness, listening. Not for sound, but for change, for shift. There were no threats, no signs, no movements where there shouldn't be. But still, she lingered. Because she knew that calm wasn't the absence of danger, just its delay. And in that pause, you learned more than in the moments of action. You learned how the ground held weight, how silence could bend, how peace was a borrowed thing, never owned. Eventually, she made her way to her own tent. It stood as it always had, modest, quiet, waiting. Its canvas edges swayed gently in the breeze, whispering secrets she had long since stopped trying to understand. She stepped inside and let the flap fall, closed, behind her. Inside, she removed her bracers slowly, setting them down with care beside her bow. Her fingers flexed in the dim light. Tired, but not trembling. She moved with the same quiet precision she had carried all day. She sat down on the bedroll, one knee pulled to her chest. No fire in here. Just the heat left from the day and the weight of cloth wrapped around worn bones. Her pack sat nearby, half unpacked, a small stone carved with a symbol from home, resting at its base. She touched it briefly, then let it go. She didn't lie down right away. She just sat, let the silence stretch, let the dark settle, let the ache in her legs speak, without words. And in that stillness, she wasn't a commander, or a symbol, or anything people made her out to be. She was just a woman with dust on her boots, scars on her fingers, and breath in her lungs. And for one moment more, that was all she needed to be. Just that, and nothing else. Sleep did not come easily, but that was nothing new. The wind outside rustled the canvas, a restless hand brushing the seams of the tent, whispering old names and forgotten promises. Somewhere near the edge of camp, a horse stamped the ground once, then fell quiet again. The stillness between those sounds stretched wide, like the silence that follows a question no one wants to answer. She lay on her side, facing the tent wall, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. One hand rested beneath her cheek, the other curled over her ribs, fingers tensed slightly. Not from fear, but instinct. The kind of readiness that doesn't need thought, only habit. Her bow lay just within reach, its curved shadow visible even in the dim light, a silhouette she knew better than her own face. She wasn't actively thinking about it, but it was there, always, like a memory stitched into the edge of consciousness. She didn't close her eyes yet. Instead, she listened, not for threat, but for balance, the rhythm of safety, the subtle consistency of a place holding steady, a lull in the chaos, however temporary. Her thoughts drifted, first to the forest from earlier, the way the sunlight had caught the edges of broken leaves and that crack in the bow limb. She'd run her fingers along it gently, feeling the fault line, hidden to anyone else. Things others would miss, always called to her. How many times had she found a flaw moments before it mattered? How many cracks had she patched before they became disaster? And then there were memories. Not in a wave, but slow, like rain on canvas. One drop, then another. Faces she hadn't seen in years. Friends who had stood beside her on battle lines and vanished in the same breath. A burnt clearing. A half-sung melody shared on a midnight shift. The kind of memories that didn't demand attention, but wouldn't leave either. She let them come, let them pass. Smoke on the breeze, footprints fading. Eventually, her breath settled. The tension in her shoulders uncoiled. She sank deeper into the bedroll. Her eyes stayed open, tracking the faint ripple of the tent ceiling with each gust of wind. Her fingers tapped an old rhythm against her thigh, one she didn't even realize she was doing. Time bent oddly in the hush. Minutes widened. A single blink might hold an hour's worth of thought. She wasn't asleep, but she wasn't entirely awake either. Somewhere in the quiet fold between. Then, a soft knock against the tent's side. Barely a sound, but it was enough to bring her fully back. She didn't jump, just blinked once, slowly. Then sat up, every motion fluid. The flap opened under her hand. A scout stood outside, eyes sharp, lips pale. Breath hitched, hood pulled low against the cold. They saw movement, the scout whispered, barely more than breath. Beyond the tree line, moving quick, not ours. No hesitation, no questions. She nodded once. That was all it took. In one motion, her cloak was cast back, bracers buckled, fingers curled around the bow's grip. Every muscle awake, aligned, alive. The camp behind her slept on, unaware of the night's turn. But it wouldn't for long. She stepped out into the dark. The stars looked down, silent witnesses to what was coming. The ground beneath her felt firm, cold, ready. And whatever had stirred out there in the black, it had just lost its head start. There was no alarm, no horn, no rallying cry. Just quiet motion, fast, focused, and without waste. The kind of movement born from instinct rather than planning, from the kind of readiness you carry in your bones after too many seasons at the edge of danger. She moved through the sleeping camp like a shadow cast by something older than light. The fire pits had gone low, most burned down to their last coals, warm only if you stood close enough to feel their breath. Only a few lamps flickered near the sentry posts, their light barely reaching beyond the footpath. The soft sound of her boots brushing dry earth followed her. Each step was measured, deliberate. The slight creak of the bough against her back whispered along with the steady rhythm of her breath. Others stirred. A few emerged from tents, commanders, scouts, and night watch, drawn by the same whisper that had reached her. Their expressions were quiet, but alert. No shouting, no clamor. The hush remained. Urgency without panic. Precision without noise. This wasn't the first time they'd woken to something uncertain. It wouldn't be the last. She met the scout again at the northern edge, where the trees began. The camp lights thinned out there, swallowed by the woods. The air here was sharper, touched by frost, and the scent of pine and damp leaves hung thick in the stillness. The scout pointed, a simple gesture, a flick of the wrist, and a nod. That direction, they murmured. 15, maybe 20 lengths out. Gone now, but quick, too clean. She nodded once. No wasted words, then stepped forward, past the last tent line, into the dark. The forest welcomed her like it remembered her weight. She didn't rush. Each step was chosen, soft and silent. Her eyes adjusted quickly. The shadows didn't hide things from her. They revealed them, textures, outlines, paths made visible only by what they displaced. The wind shifted gently, brushing through the branches like a breath over quiet skin. Branches above swayed, leaves whispering back and forth, harmless. But something beneath that stillness clung too tightly to the air. There was tension here. Not fear. She didn't believe in fear. But something that pulled the world taut, like a bowstring held just short of release. She moved deeper into the trees, past moss-covered trunks and brush damp with evening dew. Near a cluster of rocks, she dropped to a crouch. There, light tracks. A heel mark pressed slightly too deep. A crushed stem. A scrape on the bark, fresh and narrow. Most wouldn't notice. Most wouldn't care. She did. She stayed low, breathing slow, not chasing, listening. The woods weren't silent anymore. They were holding their breath, and she knew what it felt like when the land was waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. She didn't care. Time didn't live out here, not in places where every second stretched into meaning. Then, movement, just ahead. A flicker between trees, not animal, too upright, too smooth. Her muscles tightened with the recognition. She rose slightly, bow in hand now, not drawn. Not yet, just ready. The readiness that lives behind the eyes, not in the fingers. The figure slipped between the trunks like it knew she was watching. It didn't flee. It moved with confidence, testing, teasing. It paused once, just long enough for her to glimpse the shape of a hood, the flicker of something metallic at the hip. Not a blade. Something else. She memorized it in a heartbeat. Then it vanished. She didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, she stood in the dark, letting the silence flood back in, listening to the space it had left behind, measuring it. And she smiled. Just barely. A knowing curve of her mouth, not of humor, but of understanding. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. It was message. Movement designed to be seen. An invitation. Or a warning. Maybe both. And that meant they were close enough to start showing their hand. She turned back toward the direction of camp, eyes scanning the dark as she walked. The night was far from over, and she had no plans to sleep. There would be more footsteps to follow, more stories waiting to unfold between trees, and she would be ready for all of it. The camp didn't feel the change. Not all at once. But she did. It started in the air, just a shift. The wind turned colder, not with weather, but with intention. A deliberate kind of cold, the sort that didn't come from clouds or altitude. It crawled beneath her cloak and settled against her skin, bringing with it the weight of something watching. The kind of cold that moved behind your ribs and made old scars ache. The kind that stirred instincts, older than words. She stood at the edge of the firelight, watching its flickering reach weaken with every step she took into the woods again. Her eyes had already adjusted. She didn't need light anymore. Not here. Not for this. Sleep had left her. Left everyone, really. Even those still tucked inside their bedrolls were only pretending. The stillness in the camp was thin, brittle. One wrong breath, and it would crack wide open. There was no going back to rest. Not tonight. The trees closed in faster this time, as if they too had been waiting. Branches dipped lower than they had hours before. The canopy overhead pressed down with a weight that wasn't entirely physical. Shadows didn't just fall. They leaned. They followed. They watched. She wasn't chasing anything. Not yet. Just walking. Tracking not footprints, but feeling. Listening for the kind of silence that only comes after something has moved through a place. That long pause before the world starts breathing again. She knew that kind of silence. It was the same kind left behind after a battle ends. Her boots pressed into soft earth, the soil damp from unseen dew. She moved between brush and root, with a grace that required no thought. Her fingers brushed over tree trunks and hanging vines, not to steady herself, but to listen with her skin. Every inch forward was a question posed to the forest, and so far, it answered only with patience. Then she saw it. Not the figure from before, not directly, but its trace. Caught on a low branch, a thin thread, maybe two. Silk, number cloth, dark, torn, left behind perhaps by accident, or maybe not, maybe on purpose. A sign meant only for someone like her, someone who would notice, someone who would care. She took it gently, studied the texture between her fingers, then tucked it into her belt. A puzzle piece, a clue. Something meant to linger. The path curved and narrowed, pressing her between walls of underbrush. She followed it. Leaves rustled around her, whispering things in a language no one had ever spoken aloud. She didn't try to make sense of it. She just listened. The wind tugged her hair sideways, colder now, sharper. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, an owl called once, then went silent. One note, then nothing. Up ahead, the trees peeled back into a clearing she hadn't expected. A pocket of moonlight had found its way through the canopy, painting everything in silver and shadow. The air here was still, waiting. In the center stood a stone, not a boulder, not random, placed, flat-topped, smooth, marked. She approached slowly, every sense sharpened. The markings on the stone were shallow, etched deliberately, circles within circles, lines connected like pathways. A pattern that didn't mean anything yet, but would. She traced the edges with her fingers, following their rhythm, trying to feel what hands had carved them. They weren't recent, but they weren't old either. Someone had been here recently, someone who wanted to be noticed, but only by someone who could understand the difference between noise and signal. She stepped back slowly, scanned the tree line. The clearing was empty, still, but not dead. Everything listened. This wasn't just a trail anymore. This was a message, a ritual, a signal fire without flame, and she had just been invited to respond. She crouched near the stone, reached into the small pouch at her side, and pulled out a stub of charcoal wrapped in cloth. Without hesitation, she marked her own sign beneath the stranger's. Not large, not aggressive, but there, sharp, precise. Her voice on stone, not an answer, just a reply. Then she stood, the cold deeper now, more personal, as if the forest itself had turned its face toward her. The game had changed, and she wasn't just playing it. She was part of it now. One step closer, one breath deeper, and the night was only just beginning. The sound came at first like a breath caught between trees, faint and irregular, too soft for alarm, too steady to ignore. It threaded through the air like a secret on the verge of being spoken. She heard it before she saw anything. A rhythm, not natural, not wind, something dragging against the ground, slow and purposeful. It wasn't random. It wasn't lost. It was deliberate. She stepped away from the stone, back into the tree line, her hand resting lightly on the bough as her eyes scanned the shadows. Her body shifted without thought, the kind of motion that belonged to memory more than muscle. Her ears filtered everything, separating leaf from footstep, wind from breath. The clearing behind her held its silence like a sealed room. The charcoal mark she had left on the flat stone remained undisturbed, as though time itself respected it. But this new presence didn't belong to the ritual she'd answered. It came from deeper in the forest, where the trees tangled together like arguments never settled, roots rising like the bones of old stories buried shallow. Her breath slowed. Her muscles softened without relaxing. Every inch of her felt the space, measured it. She wasn't tense. She was poised, like a bow pulled just enough to feel its strength, but not enough to let go. She moved carefully, angling toward the sound. Her path was barely visible, more suggestion than trail. But she didn't need one. The terrain beneath her feet was uneven, slick with moss in some places, cluttered with dry needles in others. Roots rose through the earth like ribs, but she didn't stumble. Her steps were deliberate, light, practiced. The silence moved with her instead of against. Then, a figure emerged, not fully, just a shoulder first, a flicker of motion behind the undergrowth. Her breath caught, but her hands didn't move. She didn't raise her weapon. She waited. The figure stepped forward, just enough to be seen, not enough to reveal. No face, no insignia, just a posture. It wasn't lost. It didn't stumble. It knew where it stood. Worse, it knew where she was. Neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with sound, the hiss of shifting branches, the hush of leaves and wind, the deep creak of an old tree stretching under weight. She studied the stance. One hand hovered near a belt, not drawing, not threatening, just aware. She shifted her stance in reply, not to intimidate, but to say, "I see you. I understand. I am not afraid." Time stretched between them, like thread pulled taut. Then the figure raised a hand, not fast, not high, just a slow, open gesture, an offering. Then, with the same controlled precision, it dropped something onto the ground between them. A pouch, cloth, weathered. It hit the earth without a sound. She stayed still, watched as the figure turned, the cloak folding around it like a closing book. No rustling, no sound of retreat, no footsteps to follow, no scent to track. It came and went, like a riddle, meant to be solved, not chased. She waited 3 full breaths before moving. Then she stepped forward and knelt. The ground was cold, but not damp. The pouch was rough to the touch, hand-stitched, aged by wear. She opened it carefully. Inside were pieces, dried leaves, not local, crushed bark, resinous, pungent. A small strip of leather, worn smooth at the edges by fingers. And at the bottom, a stone pendant, flat and pale, carved with a symbol she didn't recognize. But as her thumb traced its grooves, something stirred inside her. Not memory, recognition, the feeling of almost remembering a name you've never said out loud. This wasn't a threat. It was a message. She turned the pendant over again, pressing it into her palm. There was warmth there, faint but undeniable. Someone had carried it not long ago. Someone had let it go with purpose. The game she was in, whatever it was, had just shifted. It wasn't hidden anymore. It was here, awake, and now it had acknowledged her. She stood slowly, slipping the pouch into a fold of her cloak, her eyes lifted back toward the trees, the place where the figure had been. There was nothing there now. But the air still felt marked, like the space remembered being occupied. He had not run. He had delivered. And now the next move was hers to make. The forest didn't press her. The shadows didn't chase. But they watched. And they waited. She adjusted the strap on her bow and turned toward the thicker part of the woods. Her feet found direction without needing to look down. The pendant rested against her chest now, tucked away but present. The clearing was behind her. The camp was far away. The old trail had ended, and ahead of her the path forward had no name, just purpose, and that was exactly the way she wanted it. The forest deepened, both around her and within her. It folded over the path like a cloak, dimming the world in layers of shadow and breath. Every tree stood like a sentinel, every branch like a whispered warning held in stillness. Her steps were steady, her breathing calm, but the air had shifted. It wasn't fear that crept beneath her skin. It was recognition. She walked with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from knowing where you are, but from knowing that you belong there. She didn't check her direction, She didn't question her pace. The ground guided her, a quiet partner in a dance older than language. The trees grew taller here, thicker, their trunks wide and twisted with age. Some leaned together as if in council. Others stood apart like loners. Moss clung to everything, softening the world's edges with green velvet. Vines hung like curtains between her and the rest of the world. The ground was uneven, but familiar beneath her feet. Each step made no sound. Her boots met the earth like they'd been here before. The pendant sat warm against her chest, its weight shifting ever so slightly with her movement. It pulsed, not in light or sound, but in something quieter, more insistent, a thrum that echoed in her bones, in time with a rhythm she hadn't known she remembered. She hadn't looked at it again. Not yet. But she felt it. Not like an object, but like a thought, always there, reshaping others in its presence. It had changed something, not just the night, not just her path, but her. It had become part of her pace, her stillness, her decision to keep walking deeper. Ahead, the woods opened again, not into a clearing, but into a space where the trees gave just enough room to breathe. It was darker here, less moonlight, more shadow, but it wasn't threatening. It was watching. It felt like entering a hall, not of stone, but of silence, with pillars that grew from soil and time. The quiet here was thick, not heavy, not dangerous, just deliberate. She slowed, kneeling beside a fallen log covered in ivy and years. The bark peeled easily beneath her fingers, revealing pale wood below. There were markings there, scratches, shallow grooves, not made by weather, not made by accident. Someone else had knelt here once, maybe long ago, maybe just last night. She ran a finger along the indentations. Not letters, but a pattern, like the one on the pendant, only rougher, rushed. A message scribbled in the language of the forest. Her pulse remained steady. This was no trap. This was a trail. And every piece added to the language she was learning, one carved into bark and stone and silence. She could almost hear it now, not as sound, but as understanding, a kind of call and response, where even her quiet was part of the answer. A soft shift in the branches behind her made her turn, slow and smooth, nothing visible. But the air had thickened, not danger, presence. The forest was holding its breath. She rose and continued, stepping over the log and deeper into the hush. Then she heard it, singing, barely above the wind. Just a single voice, humming a melody too old to be traced. No words, just tone. It was worn and raw and full of something ancient. It drifted from somewhere ahead, carried between trees, sometimes closer, sometimes far. The sound didn't ask her to follow. It expected her to. She obeyed. Her steps grew slower. Her body softened. Her breath fell into rhythm with the song. The forest accepted her passage like it had been waiting for it. Leaves shifted under her feet, like a welcome mat laid for silence. The humming faded, replaced by something stranger. Stillness. She reached another clearing, smaller than the first. The edges of the space were ringed with thorns, but none blocked her way. In the center stood a tree, larger than the rest, black bark, twisting limbs. Its branches reached in every direction like open arms or coiled limbs, impossible to tell which. It did not sway. It did not creak. It simply stood, as if even time had stopped to respect its roots. Beneath it, a circle of stones. Not random, perfect, precise. And within that circle, nothing. Not yet. But the absence felt shaped, held, intentional. She stepped forward, the pendant humming now, not with sound, but sensation. Each heartbeat felt like an answer to a question she hadn't spoken. Her breath caught. The space wasn't empty. It was waiting, watching, weighing. She entered the circle, stood still, and closed her eyes. Her fingers rested lightly on the pendant. Her feet stood grounded and still, not braced, open. No instruction had been given, no invitation spoken, no promise made. But she knew. She was not here to watch. She was here to be seen. She was not here to seek. She was part of what had been sought, and whatever had drawn her this far was ready to see her now, and perhaps speak her name. The stillness didn't break. It shifted, subtly, like the first moment the tide begins to change, so quiet it might go unnoticed. But she noticed. Her breath caught slightly, not in fear, but in attention. Her fingers remained on the pendant, and for a moment, the world held itself in perfect, weighted silence. Then the tree in the center of the clearing breathed, not like a person, not with lungs, but with presence. The bark didn't move, yet something within it stirred. The air shifted toward her as if pulled gently by her standing there. The pendant throbbed once against her chest, and she opened her eyes. She wasn't alone. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing, not approaching, just there, like shadows made flesh, each of them cloaked in fabric that moved as though it remembered wind but did not need it. Their faces were hidden, not by masks, but by shadow that light refused to reveal. They didn't speak, and neither did she. Not yet. The moment wasn't for words. One of them lifted a hand and pointed, not at her, but at the tree. The gesture was slow, deliberate, not a command. A direction. She looked back at the tree, and this time she saw it clearly. In the center of its trunk, just beneath the first thick branch, was a hollow. She hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there before. But now it waited, wide enough for a hand, lined with carvings that spiraled in toward its center. She stepped forward. No one stopped her. The grass inside the stone circle bent gently under her boots but did not break. The air grew denser with each step, not heavy, but rich, layered, like walking through memory. She reached the hollow and placed her hand inside without hesitation. The pendant at her chest warmed rapidly, glowing softly through the fabric of her cloak. The carvings inside the tree lit up in response, thin lines of light crawling outward in every direction. Not fire, not magic. Something else. Something older. She felt it first, in her palm. Pressure, not pain. Then across her shoulders, then down her spine. Her name wasn't spoken aloud, but it was heard. Known. Accepted. The tree answered her. Light spilled from its trunk, brief and bright. She closed her eyes. Not against it, but into it. And when she opened them again, the figures were gone. The tree still stood. The clearing still held its breath. But the pendant had cooled. And inside her chest, where fear had once lived, something stronger had taken root. Not power. Permission. She stepped back from the tree, hand now marked faintly with the spirals from within. The mark didn't burn. It didn't shine. But she felt it. The night hadn't changed. Not really, but she had. She turned from the clearing without looking back. Her footsteps no longer followed a trail. They created one. And in the woods behind her, the silence closed gently around the place she'd stood. Like a page turned slowly and with care. She moved through the forest like a thread pulled forward by unseen hands, no longer seeking direction but leaving it in her wake. The air clung to her skin, thick with the weight of something fulfilled, and the trees no longer felt like sentinels. They felt like kin, ancient and welcoming. The path ahead was not lit, but it was clear. Her every footstep seemed to hum in harmony with the soil, a quiet song of connection that deepened with every step. The mark on her hand still pulsed faintly. It didn't hurt. It didn't speak. But it was alive. It vibrated with memory, like the echo of a bell long after the strike, carrying an energy that didn't fade, but flowed into her bloodstream, steady and soft. Her fingers brushed it occasionally, unconsciously, grounding her in the knowledge that whatever had happened back there, at the tree, with the figures, with the light, it had not been a dream. It had not been ceremony for ceremony's sake. It had been a passage, a rite of recognition. Something sacred had been witnessed, and now she carried the proof beneath her skin. She paused at a ridge, overlooking a slope blanketed in mist. Below, a river curled like silver thread, its banks shrouded in fog and moonlight. The sound of its flow was distant, but constant, like a voice whispering truths to the earth. She crouched there for a while, not to rest, but to witness, to see the land again with new eyes. She noticed the rhythm of the wind as it swayed treetops far below, the quiet movement of distant animals, barely audible, the sleeping breath of a world that didn't know it had just changed. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs and press against her ribs like a reminder that she was still here, still moving, still part of this place. A fox appeared on the opposite ridge, still and silent. Its coat shimmered faintly under the pale light, and its eyes met hers for a long, unblinking moment. There was something knowing in its gaze, recognition without question. Then, without sound or hesitation, it turned and vanished into the mist, not in fear, in understanding, in respect. She rose and made her descent, careful but sure-footed. The slope was steep in places, littered with loose stones and tangled roots, but her feet found each step as if guided. The mist swallowed her up quickly, thickening around her shoulders and filling the spaces between trees. But she didn't falter. Her breath stayed calm. Her pace didn't waver. The pendant hung quietly now, warm and inert. Its job was done, for the moment, but she knew it would speak again when needed. As she reached the riverbank, she knelt and dipped her fingers into the water. It was colder than she expected, sharper. It cut through the warmth in her bones and startled her into clarity. It woke something. She cupped her hands and brought the water to her face, letting it run down her cheeks, into her hair, across her neck. It cleansed nothing. It erased nothing. But it marked the moment. It sealed the journey so far, a pause before what came next, a ritual of her own choosing. The stars shifted above her. One blinked out. Another flared. The world continued its slow, secret rotations, turning endlessly through a sky she now felt more connected to than ever. She felt the pulse of it all, root to leaf, stone to cloud, breath to breath. Behind her, the forest watched, quiet and aware. It no longer judged or tested. It witnessed. Ahead of her, the unknown waited, patient and open, like a blank page willing to be written upon. But inside her, something had awakened that would never sleep again. It had form, not of fire or force, but of clarity, a center that no longer shifted, a truth that echoed quietly with every heartbeat. She did not smile. She simply stood and walked on. Morning had not yet arrived, but the night had shifted. It no longer felt like darkness. It felt like prelude. A pause before the first note, full of meaning, full of weight. The air carried a silence that was full rather than empty, stretched taut across the forest like a drum waiting to be struck. Her boots pressed lightly into the soil as she followed the river's edge, its winding path now her own. Mist hovered just above the ground, curling around her ankles like smoke, not hiding her from the world but binding her to it, like a veil meant not to conceal but to connect. She moved without hesitation, her senses wide open, not alert in the old way, not scanning for threats, but tuned to something greater. She could feel the rhythm of the forest, the slow inhale and exhale of a living world that pulsed in time with her breath. The trees no longer loomed as strangers or threats. They leaned toward her, close and familiar, their branches arching as if to greet her. The roots beneath her feet felt less like obstacles and more like veins in the body of something ancient, something shared. Her mark hummed in rhythm with her steps, quiet but insistent, like a heartbeat beneath the surface, a living reminder of the choice she had made. She passed through an arch of 2 leaning trees and entered a stretch of land she had never seen before. The mist grew thinner here, but the quiet deepened. Even the river, constant companion, seemed to hush its flow as it curved gently to the east. This clearing was different, not sacred like the one with the tree, but deliberate. It held the stillness of a place where decisions had been made, a place shaped by memory, a gathering site perhaps, or a crossroads, where stories paused before turning into something new. In the center stood a stone, but not carved like the sacred markers of before. It was natural, rough, weather-worn by time and weather, by moss and rain and wind. Upon it sat a bundle, cloth-wrapped, tied with thin twine, nestled as if placed with care. Someone had been here, recently, and they had left this behind. Not by accident, as a sign, as a gift. She approached carefully, not because she feared it, but because it felt like a conversation. The kind where you don't interrupt, where silence is part of the message. She crouched beside it and untied the bundle. Her fingers moved gently, aware of their role. Inside was food, simple travel fare, dried roots, a small flask of water, and a folded note, pressed flat against the base, held by nothing but the weight of intention. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the soft, worn edges. The words were inked with precision, the kind of hand that writes rarely but always with purpose. You are close now. The path ahead may not show itself all at once. Trust the quiet. Trust the pull. No name, no signature. But the message was meant for her. She could feel it. Not in the ink. In the silence between the lines. She folded the note again and returned it to the bundle, then sat beside the stone and ate in silence. The food was plain, but filling. The water tasted like spring, clean and deep, like the source of something untouched. With every bite, she felt more settled, more rooted in this moment, in this space. Not heavy, but grounded, supported, as if the land itself had chosen to nourish her. She remained there longer than she needed to, not because of weariness, but out of respect. Letting the moment stretch, letting her presence sink into the earth. Afterward, she stood again. The mist had begun to lift. The sky above was turning. The black was bleeding into blue, soft and slow. The first suggestion of light stretched at the edges of the trees, delicate and patient. She didn't rush. There was no need. The day would come whether she was ready or not, but she felt ready now. Not because she had rested, not because she had answers, but because she no longer needed either to keep walking. Her steps were no longer driven by urgency but by purpose. Her heart beat quietly but surely, and that was enough. She turned east, following the bend of the river, her steps quiet, her soul steady. The forest no longer felt like something she passed through. It felt like something that moved with her. It no longer needed to watch. It had accepted her, embraced her. The forest didn't watch anymore. It walked with her. And ahead, where the mist parted and the sky began to color, there was more to become. The light came slowly, not as a sudden burst, but as a soft exhale from the horizon. It didn't shout. It crept, gentle and golden, replacing the last hush of night with something warmer. A glow that stretched across the trees, glinting against the leaves and painting the edges of her cloak in faint amber. She walked beneath it, her shadow forming faintly at her heels, stretching behind her like a thread connecting her to all she had already walked through. Morning had arrived, not with fanfare, but with quiet acceptance. A subtle shift, a recognition that something had ended and something else had begun. Birdsong stirred around her, not all at once, one call then another. A scattered conversation waking up between the leaves. It started at the edge of hearing and grew slowly, like fireflies blinking into existence. The forest stirred, not surprised to find her still here. It had never expected her to leave. It had watched her pass each threshold without question, and now it seemed to breathe with her, not beside her. The rhythm of her footsteps matched the rustle of branches, the hush of wind, the soft crackle of dry leaves underfoot. The river beside her widened, then narrowed again, threading itself through roots and rock. It sang louder now, no longer whispering. A melody more confident, more open. It bounced off stone and flowed around her, as if recognizing her presence. She followed its curves, with a calm that came from within, not enforced by the world around her. There were no signs to follow, no commands, just instinct, and something deeper than instinct, a certainty that didn't need to be named. Her journey was no longer a search, it was a continuation. She came upon a low hill where the trees broke apart, revealing a rise covered in dew-laced grass. It glistened in the early light, untouched. A patch of earth, preserved by quiet. She climbed it slowly, letting each step be its own. No need to hurry, no need to stop. At the top, she turned and looked back. She didn't have to, but she did, because something in her asked her to witness, to see what had been. The forest stretched endlessly behind her, a sea of green and silver mist, wrapped in its own mystery. It pulsed like a memory, vast and ancient, humming with the presence of everything she'd left behind, and everything that had shaped her. It felt distant and intimate at once. She could still feel the weight of its silence, the curve of its questions, but she wasn't bound to it anymore. She had been changed by it, marked, but she had also stepped beyond it, and she knew, deeply and without doubt, that it would always recognize her if she returned. Ahead, the land was different. Not wild, not settled, just open. Rolling hills and patches of stone. Roads that weren't roads yet. Possibility dressed in the shape of horizon. It felt new. Not an age, but an invitation. A place unspoken for, waiting not to be conquered, but to be known. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her lungs filled with cold air, touched by dew and light, her boots brushing through damp grass that yielded without resistance. Not away, but onward. The pendant no longer hummed, but it warmed slightly against her skin, as if to acknowledge the shift. Her mark no longer pulsed. It simply rested there, quiet, complete. She was not being called. She was not being led. She was being allowed. Not summoned, not tested, not driven. Allowed to choose. Allowed to move in her own rhythm. Allowed to be. She reached a bend in the trail and paused. Something stirred in the air, a scent she hadn't smelled in days. Smoke. Not fire, not danger. Campfire. People. Nearby. The hint of a meal. Of stories shared in half-sleep. Of hands held near warmth. It wrapped itself around her like a thread tugging at memory. She adjusted her cloak and tightened the strap of her bow. Not out of caution, but habit. A small ritual. A quiet gesture that said, I am still myself. I am still ready. The world was waking, and so was she. Not with a jolt, not from sleep, but with awareness, with intention. She didn't know what waited just over the next hill, but she walked toward it without hesitation, because whatever came next, she was ready. And more than that, she belonged. She crested the hill with the rising sun behind her, the light now stronger, casting longer shadows that spilled over the grass like ink on parchment. It wrapped around her frame and painted the ridgeline in soft gold. The scent of campfire grew sharper, mingled now with the subtle tang of ash, the richness of earth, and the sweetness of cooked roots and damp moss. She paused just beneath the ridge, crouching low in the high grass, her hand brushing lightly over the earth. Warm. Software. A place where feet had passed, but not long ago. The imprint of presence lingered in the soil. She moved forward with quiet intent, her cloak trailing behind her like the echo of a decision already made. Every step was measured, not in caution, but in reverence. At the bottom of the slope, half shielded by a curve of land and a line of boulders softened by age, lay a small camp. Smoke lifted lazily from the fire, curling into the air like a question left unanswered. 3 figures sat in a loose circle around a dying fire. They weren't armored. No guards, no watch. Just travelers, cloaked and quiet, nursing the remnants of sleep and warmth. One stirred, sensing her approach, though she made no sound. She didn't hide. She stepped forward openly, the early light catching her shoulders and glinting faintly off the bough at her back. The trio turned slowly to meet her gaze. No weapons raised, no fear, just curiosity. The kind of curiosity only carried by those who've been walking a long time, through places without maps, toward things that can not be named. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen many winters, nodded once, not in greeting, but in understanding. The space between them did not need to be filled with questions. The forest had taught them the same language. The nod wasn't permission. It was recognition. "You're not lost," the woman said softly. She shook her head. "Not anymore." The others made space by the fire, shifting aside their packs. Their presence neither welcoming nor closed, just real. Their movement was slow, natural, like rocks settling into place. She lowered herself to the earth and sat. Her boots exhaled dust. The warmth of the stones beneath her seeped into her bones, soothing the ache of miles walked and moments survived. No one asked her name, no one told her theirs, and yet a kind of knowing settled among them like mist. They were not the beginning of something, nor the end, just a moment on the same path. The kind of moment that doesn't ask for explanation. Someone handed her a tin cup of something hot, bitter, comforting. The scent rose slowly, a curl of warmth that eased into her lungs. She sipped slowly, letting it coat her tongue and trail heat down her throat. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. The fire crackled softly, and for a time, the world did nothing but breathe. The silence held them gently, not as a void, but as a cradle. As the sun climbed higher, they began to speak, not in stories, but in fragments, pieces of places, names of winds, warnings wrapped in smiles, descriptions of paths too narrow for horses, and trees that whispered secrets only at dawn. Their words were not heavy. They didn't need to be. The silence between them had weight enough. Their voices moved like water, slow and unforced, shaping themselves around what needed to be said and what didn't. She didn't know how long she would stay, an hour, a day, long enough to let her bones cool and her thoughts settle, long enough to listen, to absorb, but not long enough to root. She had become someone who did not linger where things were comfortable. She carried the forest inside her now, because beyond this camp, beyond this warmth, the trail waited, not with urgency, but with promise. The kind of promise that doesn't shout. The kind that breathes and waits for you to meet it. And when she left, she would not say goodbye. That word no longer fit her journey. She would simply walk. Because now, wherever her feet touched the ground, she was part of the story. And the story had only just begun. The sun had risen fully by the time she broke camp, but the fire behind her was left smoldering, just enough to suggest a memory, not an invitation. She didn't speak as she left. None of them did. They simply nodded, a gesture full of quiet respect and shared understanding. There was no need for ceremony. The parting was simple, natural, as if their paths had only ever meant to cross, not tangle. She followed a narrow trail veering east, marked not by footprints but by the bending of grass and the lean of branches. The world had shifted with the daylight. Birds now moved in flocks, insects hummed, and the wind carried warmth instead of warning. Each sound felt clearer, like the forest itself had exhaled after a long breath held in sleep. The weight on her shoulders was lighter now, not because it had lessened, but because she had grown stronger beneath it. The path took her past a grove of old trees, tall, gnarled things with roots so thick they split the ground like veins. She slowed there, fingers brushing against bark etched with time. A marking caught her eye, subtle, nearly faded. A symbol, the same spiral etched into her skin. She stood there for a long moment, tracing it silently, unsure if it had been meant for her, or if she had simply become someone who could see it now. Further on, she reached a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. A small village rested there, rooftops tilted, smoke curling upward, and distant figures tending to morning chores. It looked peaceful, untouched by whatever truths the forest had whispered into her bones. And yet, even from this distance, she felt a pull, not of threat, but of purpose. Something waited there, or perhaps someone. She descended slowly, the wind tugging at her cloak, bringing with it scents of soil, wildflowers, and baking bread. Civilization. She hadn't expected to meet it so soon. She hadn't expected to welcome it. At the village edge, a boy spotted her first and ran off before she could speak. A moment later, an older man appeared, weathered, wary, but not unkind. His eyes studied her, flicking briefly to the bow, the cloak, the silent confidence in her stance. "You've come a long way," he said. She nodded once. "I have." He didn't ask more, just stepped aside, motioning, to the path leading into the heart of the village. "There's food if you need it. Rest, too. You look like you've earned both." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She passed him with a nod, the scent of fresh bread stronger now. Laughter in the distance, the clatter of tools. Life. Not adventure, not danger, just life. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to step into it. She didn't know what this place held, what stories lived behind each door, what ghosts still walked its paths. But she knew she would learn, because her journey had taught her this much. The forest gives you questions. The world gives you the chance to live into the answers. And she was ready to begin again.